It's a pleasure to have you here, and especially to be able to talk to you about this topic that you have so many unique angles of experience to draw on, to reflect on. And the starting point, I think, that we can probably agree on is that any social formation where power is concentrated in the hands of someone who's considered so far superior to others that their actions cannot be questioned is liable to have abuse. And that for that reason, all kinds of communities and in all kinds of sectors of society, we do see abuse of power and sexual abuse. And that observation does not mean that we naturalize it or normalize it. And there are a few times when I've heard or seen Buddhists admit that there was abuse in their communities, they'll say, well, there was abuse here, but it happens everywhere. So the idea, I think, is like, don't judge us too harshly. But in the case of Buddhism, distinct from other social formations, Buddhist teachers present Buddhism as a refuge or as a safe space. And Buddhist teachers are presented as someone who is entirely committed to the good of the students. And so Buddhism is sort of set up by all of us who are transmitting it and practicing it as a place that's in some way apparently different from worldly places, different from ordinary refuges or samsaric spaces. The values are different, the relationships are different. So when we discover, as we are doing again and again, that Buddhist teachers abuse their power and have sexually abused students, not all of them, but actually surprisingly many, that we do have this sense of surprise and even a sense of double betrayal. And you've experienced that, coming to be aware that there are seriously unhealthy dynamics in Buddhist communities in a number of different times in your career. You came to realize that the Buddhist community that you were practicing in initially was a cult. You went through the process of having the scales drop and have your eyes opened, and you stayed Buddhist, and you continued and you actually deepened your commitment to the monastic path, and you ended up shifting communities and receiving your full ordination from the Dalai Lama. Then you've been so active in other communities, helping educate around cult dynamics and having people understand and able to identify what are healthy dynamics. And then you have ended up being, as far as I know, probably the only Buddhist monk within Tibetan Buddhism to speak openly about abuse. And certainly you are a person that many, many survivors of abuse by Buddhist teachers seek out as a resource, seek out as someone they can talk to. You have a blog that's making this public. And so I'm sort of curious to hear from you in these different experiences of realizing that the place that you're in is violating trust and is not what you thought it was. You got yourself out, or you shifted, or you did something with that information that allowed you to stay Buddhist, but in some sense maybe has taught you something, or has, as I've found in my own case, has actually ended up really sort of kind of propelling a new stage of growth in practice. And so I want to ask you, what do you do with the violation of trust, this process of having trust violated, of becoming deceived, disappointed, brokenhearted on the spiritual path? What do you do with that, and how has that allowed you to continue and maybe even, been made useful in your path?
Yeah, thank you for your question. First of all, I would like to say I never, ever wanted to be into such topics. I just started as someone who wanted to use Buddhism to change myself. I wanted to become less egoistic, less stingy, more generous. I needed ethical guidelines to find some direction in my life. And so I opened up for Buddhism and initially made good experiences. But on the way, I bumped into strange things. And these things affected me. So then the question is, if you face things which you didn't expect, what do you do with it? So, and for me, a spiritual path means I open up myself to face what is right in front of me. And then I try to deal with what is in front of me in a realistic and also a dharmic manner. So this is just as a preface to say this clearly, because actually it was not an intention for me to get into these topics. It was a side topic. Initially, it became more relevant when I was part of a damaging Buddhist cult. It became even more relevant when I left the cult. Actually, 2 teachers had fear to go to hell, to never meet ever good qualified teachers in the future because I left 2 teachers and so on. So, and I had post-traumatic stress disorder. So I had just to face all these things and to work through it. And luckily, this is quite of an exception, I got all the support I needed for my healing, which other people didn't find. And so my healing process was only 4 or 4.5 years, and it was not too long. Usually 4 years is quite quick. It would take usually longer, but I got so much excellent support. Just to say this initially. And so basically, my practice is not to educate on cults. My practice is not to deal with sexual abuse issues. My practice is to meditate, to study, and to find peace and growth within the methods of Buddhism. And I have Buddhist teachers from all traditions. So Buddhism for me is nourishment for my mind. So I want to say this clearly because sometimes people only perceive me as the one guy who addresses these issues. And you could even say I became a bit infamous or famous, whatever you want to call it. But actually, it's not my topic, really. My topic is Dharma practice and to work on my mind. So now to come to your question, to answer your question about with the fate and the betrayal of fate. So what was very helpful for me is then to use Buddhism to help myself. And so what I did, I looked into the definition of faith. And so as you know, there are 3 types of faith. The first type is the clear faith or the inspirational faith. And in Sanskrit, Shraddha, the general term for faith. And actually in the definition, the object of this faith is really existing qualities. And this is important information. So when I rely on a teacher, like in the past, I relied on 2 teachers and I projected qualities in them or onto them, which I believe they are there, but they were not actually there. My faith was betrayed, but not because of their mistake. It was my mistake. Because it was my mind which projected qualities on an object, my teachers, which they obviously didn't have. So actually, I was not in line with the reality. To see the qualities I projected to the teachers were not there. So I projected qualities were not existence, and I denied or deluded myself to see really existing faults they have. And this is the second type of faith. Convincing faith also includes to see the really existing faults of something, like the faults of samsara, the faults of hate, the faults of anger, and so on. So I didn't have a realistic perspective on the teacher. So having experienced the betrayal of fate, I opened up myself to say, actually, it's my fault. I deluded myself. So I have to take responsibility for my perception to see really existing qualities. And if they are really existent, I can place or put my faith in these really existing qualities, and they have a stable foundation. Actually, if they are really there and stable, my faith cannot be betrayed. And if I see really existing faults, I wouldn't put my faith into them. I would have the conviction, yeah, these are faults. I should be aware, not be affected by it or others affected by it. Maybe I even address it. So sometimes I also approach teacher and talked about limitations I found they had in their perception. And then I started to base my spiritual path on a realistic approach on what there is as qualities and faults, and to have a more holistic perspective, instead as initially to start from a naive perspective. The guru is a Buddha. Every faults I see are my own faults. Every qualities are really on his side. This is just too naive and it's not realistic, and it didn't work. It didn't work and it doesn't work. My experience. So this would be my answer. And this is how I help myself. I use Buddhist texts to find a more nuanced, differentiated understanding of the teachings, which helps me to base my spiritual path on a realistic basis. And then my basis is stable. And if my basis is stable, I can walk, I can go on my path.
So as I'm listening to you, one of the things that comes very quickly to mind is how complicated this term really existing qualities is in a Buddhist context, and how much our interpretations, our socially constructed reality is forming part of what actually is going on. And I want to ask you about the role in communities and Buddhist teachers themselves in actively encouraging us as a spiritual practice to see the teacher, to reinterpret everything we see actively as a quality, as a positive quality, to find a way to contextualize faults, to do what you did in a healthy way, but in not necessarily so productive, to blame ourselves if we're seeing faults, to say, it's my fault that I'm seeing faults in the teacher. And this way in which, collectively Buddhist communities are enshrining their teachers and practices where we are actively encouraged to enshrine a human being as a deity, literally, right? To see the guru as a deity. So you have all of these practices and you have teachings coming from the teacher and being reinforced by the community that is actively discouraging us from being able to see what's a projection and what's not a projection, because we're actively projecting in order to have this figure of the guru that then has a function in giving blessings and making us feel secure in our practice. So what do you think about that?
Yeah, thank you. Actually, this points out the problem that the Vajrayana is not meant for beginners of Buddhist practice. And to see the teacher as a Buddha, to project qualities, but to this type of seeing as a Buddha, which can lead to projections, is not a beginner practice. So, and what helped me very much is the book by Alexander Berzin. He gives a meditation practice, which was taught by Atisha, where you contemplate the qualities of the teachers and you also contemplate the faults. And then you decide, yes, these faults exist, but abiding on the faults doesn't really help me to find inspiration. So I abide more on the qualities. And Alexander Berzin gave the example in a private teaching, like if you live in the base or in a cellar, and when you look out of the window, you see only the feet of the people or the legs. But at the same time, if there are feet and legs, there is an upper body. So at the same time, if you train your mind to see qualities and faults, you can focus on the qualities. Still, you know there are some faults, but you overemphasize them too much. And I think another point is, at one point in spiritual practice, you can even find inspiration from the faults of the teacher, because you can use the faults to reflect upon how they harm others, how they harm you. And you might also have the potential, or you have these faults yourself, and you should work on it to not harm yourself and others. And in that sense, the teacher becomes really a teacher, because you can learn from the qualities and you can learn from the faults. And in a way, it doesn't matter so much. You have growth with both things. And this approach, I find far more safe, sane, and approachable for a Western person or a beginner of Buddhist practice, and also an advanced practitioner who doesn't dive too early into Vajrayana. So I think a big problem is people dive far too early into the Vajrayana. And also Alexander Berzin said, in the Gelug tradition, that the teacher comes, the faith in the teacher comes in as the first teaching by Tsongkhapa, in Tsongkhapa's order, is because it was taught to monastics in an environment where almost everybody practiced Vajrayana. So, but if you look in the Lamrim of Gampopa, he does not start with the teacher. He starts with Buddha nature. And I find this approach far more helpful for Westerners, to have some self-confidence in yourself and then gradually approach reality. And then if you have a more sane approach to reality, you can play a little bit with projections, to bend your mind, to see maybe more good in the teacher than there is and what effect this has on you. So it's more, you play, but you have a more realistic basis. But if you start from a naive basic, it can get so poisonous. So and I think this is a problem. So I think it's a problem if people say you should reflect the faults you see in it's your faults, and all the qualities are on the side of the teacher. I think this is very dangerous. And actually the Dalai Lama himself said this also. It can become very toxic, very poisonous.
One of the things that I've noticed, and I can imagine you might have seen the same, is that many of the situations where I've heard experience of quite extraordinarily painful abuse, the teacher is the one who's telling students what an appropriate practice is. So in a certain sense, we're all beginners when we come to Buddhism, right? Those of us who weren't born in Buddhist cultures or Buddhist families, we're all beginners when we come. And as a beginner, we listen to what our teacher tells us. And in many contexts, certainly in most Gelug centers that I've been in, the first teachings are immediately encouraging you to do Vajrayana practices, to start out by making an offering to the teacher. And it's not just Gelug, in other, I'm just speaking about that because I know that is where you got your start in Tibetan Buddhism. But in the beginning, we are new, we're open, we are having the teachers shape us, train us, and tell us what an appropriate practice is or how things are practiced. And so I think, what you're pointing to is that we have a responsibility when we are approaching Buddhist practices to not assume that everything that's being told is perfect and is appropriate for us and is exactly what we should be doing right now, but we ourselves bring our critical thinking skills into that encounter, where often we think we don't need them anymore because this is, so amazing and the teacher is so wise, and we see other people that we respect who we consider to be very intelligent, putting their trust in it. But actually, we need to be applying and asking ourselves this question: which of these practices could lead to abuse? Which of these practices could lead me, to shut down aspects of my critical thinking that will get me into a lot of trouble? What are elements of what's going on that actually need to be actively questioned. And we do have a kind of trust. We are in a period where now it's getting a little tarnished, but Buddhism for a very long time in Europe and in the Americas has had a tremendous amount of goodwill and absolute benefit of the doubt. And people see you, the years or decades that I was in robes and the years that you're in robes, people immediately think, oh, you're so peaceful, I love Buddhism, even though they actually really probably couldn't tell you what Buddhism said. There's this very strong image of a peaceful and maybe even kind of enlightened European Enlightenment sense of enlightened religion. And so we don't come with all of our skepticism as activated as it seems like you're saying that we need. And I wonder if you could talk about, in the cases where you've seen abuse in Buddhist communities, what are the teachings or the practices or the ways of relating to one another that have contributed to making abuse possible?
A fundamental principle which enables abuse is the teaching seeing the guru as a Buddha, as perfect. And to attribute all faults you see onto your own deluded mind. Because then if you see inappropriate behavior from the teacher, you will use this teaching to accuse yourself. It's your impure perception to judge this as inappropriate behavior. Apropos, by the way, judgment, Rigpa stresses and stressed so much being non-judgmental. This is also part of a type of indoctrination, I would call it indoctrination, which dilutes a sane discrimination about what's right and what's wrong. Because if you cannot judge, what can you do? You undermine your discriminating awareness or discriminating intelligence, your critical faculties by being so. And actually, the question would be also, what does it mean to be non-judgmental? So, the guru thing, being non-judgmental in certain schools, it's not in all schools, is an issue. Then also sometimes teachings of Atisha, like don't think about your good qualities, think instead of the qualities of others. Don't think about the bad faults of others, but think about your own faults and treat them like bad blood or something like this. He said something like this. This can be very productive Dharma teaching in certain circumstances, but not necessarily in Western context, where people already see only faults in themselves and cannot see any qualities in themselves. This can get really toxic and poisonous. And then if you have a teacher who continues to only stress the delusions of the mind and so on, this might contribute to more and more undermine your self-esteem, your trust into your intuition. And so then you give up a little bit responsibility. I'm only bad, the teacher is only good. And then you depend on the teacher to see anything good in you. And if he sees something good in you, you feel nourished. But actually, this nourishment depends on another person. You could give it yourself by just seeing your own qualities. So this gets all very tricky. There are different teachings which contribute to this. So one is the guru thing. The other one is being non-judgmental. Sometimes this verse can be used. And then also sometimes teachings about pure and impure minds. And then if you look back, the Buddha didn't say anything like this in the basic teachings, let's say in the Theravada tradition. The Buddha said, a good student will praise what is praiseworthy, will not praise what is not being praiseworthy, but will dispraise what is worth to be dispraised. So there is so much clarity in the teachings of the Buddha to be realistic, to not praise things which are not praiseworthy. So if a guru abuses the power, it's not in line with the teachings of the Buddha to delude yourself and deny that this was abuse. And of course, abuse is a term, it's not inherently existent, it's a term being applied onto certain dynamics, let's say. But if there are dynamics which harm a student, there is harm, and this should be called harm. If the label, this is abuse, fits to this dynamic, you have to investigate. But you cannot really deny that the student has been harmed. And of course, you have to discriminate between short-term harm and long-term harm. So, and all these are some really basics. And these basics are undermined often by Vajrayana teachings, with the pure view, with the pure perception, and seeing the Buddha as the Guru as a Buddha. So I think these are key issues in that context. And you don't find this in the sutra teachings, which form the foundation of the Vajrayana. Because if I have a strong foundation to see this is correct, this is wrong, then I can play with my perception. I cannot play with my perception if I don't have a stable basis. So to give another thing, which is very important and often not looked at and also rarely taught, if you look into Tsongkhapa Slam Rinpoche Mo, he explains 3 qualities of a student you must possess to be an appropriate vessel for the Mahayana Dharma, not Vajrayana Dharma, Mahayana Dharma. And the first is intelligence, to be able to discriminate wrong from correct teachings. So, and the first question you can ask yourself, am I able, if I listen to a teacher, to say, no, this is wrong. This is not correct what you are telling. If I'm not able to discriminate wrong from correct teachings, I lack the first qualification of a student. The next is to be unbiased, which means you don't take sides to a certain tradition or school of thought. And Tsongkhapa says, if you take sides, this dilutes your perception, and you will see faults where there are no faults. And implicitly, he says, you will see qualities where there are no qualities. And then you are already in the realm of the projections. And the projections, they disconnect you from reality. Being disconnected from reality, your spiritual path is not based on reality. It will go wrong. And the third is the effort, which basically means you have a really deep wish to attain full enlightenment, which most people don't have. Because if you have a strong wish to attain enlightenment, you have a broader perspective on life and your spiritual path, and your mind is far more flexible to deal with difficulties. So, and then Tsongkhapa ends this section in his book about these 3 qualities, intelligence, unbiased, and diligence, by saying, look in your mind if you have these qualities. If you don't have them, make every effort to cultivate them in this life. And I think most students don't have these qualities, never heard about these qualities. And that's why they are carried away by misleading teachings. And teachers can tell them everything, and they just believe it.
You just made so many different points that are so important. One of them I want to go back to and kind of see if you'd be willing to expand the verse that is encouraging us to see ourselves as repositories of faults and see others as the ones who have all the qualities. And I have been asking myself for quite a while now whether, in some sense, part of the success of Tibetan Buddhism in Europe and American cultures has been the way that it's been able to tap into self-hatred, maybe too strong a word, low self-esteem. And one of the things that I have started thinking about with quite a lot of discomfort on my part is looking at which were the teachings that I sort of heard most clearly and that also were being sort of very consistently transmitted, like everything that you do is contaminated by the 8 worldly dharmas. Everything you do is full of self-interest. Everything you do is egotistical. And noticing that if we think about what was the 3-month retreat, you know, like people who really want to do some serious practice, what was a 3-month retreat that was offered again and again and again in different contexts? It was Vajrasattva practice, which is purification of one's own negative karma, where you spend 3 months thinking about all the bad things you did and asking for some deity on your crown to purify you. So how much that reinforces and taps in. And I say this because those were the 3-month retreats that we did initially. We held big group 3-month retreats where we were doing that practice. And even though, you know, I very consciously tried to sort of, let's focus on, okay, the faults, you know, they don't stain us, let go of them, see yourself as pure. What has brought people in and what makes this a compelling practice for them to dedicate 3 months to is that they feel themselves to be full of errors and negative karma and horrible deeds that they need to purify. And so to what degree have we been hooked in and had this exacerbated by teachings that are reinforcing that? And certainly the way communities are structured, where the students are more or less all here on the ground making prostrations to the holy beings who are above us, who are superior to us, who are pure while we're impure. And so just this, I want to ask you whether you think that besides just that quote from Atisha, this tendency to speak to our low self-esteem or self-hatred, or the willingness to see ourselves as full of sin or as sinners that we are bringing to our encounter with Tibetan Buddhism, might have formed part of the way that our practice and our communities get configured and how abuse becomes possible or more likely.
I learned a lot from Alexander Bersin. So he was one of the sources who helped me to sort out what went wrong. And he kindly gave a community of former harmed people from the New Kadamba tradition, my former cult, private teachings. And so he explained also a cultural background. And he said in Tibetan culture, at least in the past, there was not this type of self-hate. He said actually Tibetans have quite a lot of self-confidence, maybe a little bit too much. But they don't have to struggle with looking onto themselves in a negative way. And then if you look into the book by Howard Cutler, The Art of Happiness, he interviewed the Dalai Lama about self-hate, and the Dalai Lama didn't understand what he was talking about. And so then the Dalai Lama asked back, do you mean people in the West, they don't cherish themselves? And then Howard Cutler said, yes, exactly, they don't cherish themselves. What to say about this? And then the Dalai Lama replied back, I don't understand. I don't understand. And there are many. And he said, "Oh, are there many people who don't cherish themselves?" And Cutler said, "Yes, there are many." And so, what do you say? And the Dalai Lama said, "I cannot say anything, because this is not an issue. Self-hate, to hate myself or not cherish myself, is not an issue in our culture." So he was totally unused to the idea to not cherish yourself and to hate yourself. So, and then he said, I have to think about it. And then he met again with Cutler. You find this in Art of Happiness in the book. And then he said, actually, I think we don't have this idea of not cherishing ourselves and hating ourselves, because we have this understanding of Buddha nature. And I think this is really deeply ingrained in Tibetan culture, this Buddha nature concept. So we are basically good, and this is our identity. And in our culture, it's more like the original sin. We are basically bad. And then we grow up in an environment where always people see in us what is not correct, what should be improved. And so we grow up in a deficit culture. Something is wrong with me. I'm not good enough, and so on. So, and then based on two different cultural makeups, what helps Tibet, and this is also what Alexander Berzin said, sometimes they can be very hard-headed. So they have this type of punishing a little bit with the Dharma. You're totally stupid. Don't think about your good qualities. Think about your faults. To open up the mind, to get a little bit more flexible and soft, to open up yourself to work on it. And this method might have functioned very well in Tibetan culture. But in the West, it met a culture where people already hit themselves too much, are already too much unkind towards themselves. And so these teachings then supported patterns of seeing more faults in myself, having less appreciation for myself than I had initially even. So, and this became very toxic, I have to say. And I don't think it's a misunderstanding in the transmission. And some teacher realized this doesn't work based on their compassion and their wisdom. So I met one of the teachers. He said, don't see me as your teacher. I'm just a spiritual friend on your path. So you can use whatever I say is beneficial. If not, leave it aside. So they really try to feed your self-esteem. They feed your independent thinking. They want to make you take responsibility for yourself. So, but some teachers didn't understand it. And then these misunderstandings come up. Now, with respect to Western culture, what comes in is also, we have a very much, the Dalai Lama once criticized, is a black and white way of thinking. So something is either totally bad or something is totally good. So, and we have this type of admiration for the superstars, like musicians, actors, and so on. And we put them on thrones to have something to adore and have these elevated feelings. They must behave in a certain way. They can also behave a little bit strangely, but not too strange. But once they lose their, the basis for being adored, we put them on the ground, and this person is really bad. And so they are only bad and only good. And what we don't learn is this type of ambiguity tolerance to see, yes, there's good, but there's also bad. And good and bad can coexist. And actually, this is what the Buddha's teachings say. And this is complexity. And complexity is part of at least scientific thinking. And it's part of Buddhist thinking, complex, dependent arising. And naivety, black and white thinking, is not. So we must grow, or we must get out of this naivety mode. And this is part also seeing the guru as a complex human being, seeing the qualities, the really existing qualities, the really existing faults, finding in the long run inspiration from the faults and from the qualities, maybe have such a good relationship that you can even address also limitations with the teacher, because then also the teacher has something from it if you can address it and the teacher accepts it. So yes, I think there is much went wrong in the transmission, but there is also a change, and some teachers learn this doesn't really work, and they have more this type of nourishing mode to rather help you to build up some self-esteem. So, and then for Western culture, I would say I would reverse Atisha's teaching, start to think about your own qualities and delight in them, because this is rejoicing in your own qualities is spiritual practice. This is mudita, and it starts always from yourself. And then you build up a healthy self-esteem. You see your really existing good qualities, not projected one. Yes, this is really there. Oh, wonderful. And then you also open up to see your really existing faults. You say, yes, this is also there, but there is more than this. So if someone addresses your really existing faults, says, yes, true, I really have this limitation. You are so right. But this doesn't undermine your self-esteem, because you also have some qualities. And this is a healthy self-esteem, which is realistic. If your perception into your qualities is realistic, in your faults, you have a healthy self-esteem. This has a stable basis. Once you have done it with yourself, you can do it with others. So, and I think most people missed the first part.
I just want to jump in and say, because Buddhist teachers, we say so many things that sound great. And this that you just said sounds great, but I've observed in your handling of when you've received criticism on your blog, how absolutely willing you are to look at the possible criticism, to recognize when it's valid, and to set it aside when it's not valid without becoming defensive or, in any case, hostile towards the person who's criticizing you. And it's something that I have observed and really admired, every time that I see it, because I just want to say that you're practicing what you're preaching very much.
Thank you. But does this make sense what I said?
Yes, absolutely.
Does this answer your question? Does this answer your?
Yeah, perfectly. I want to think about the role of community. We've been thinking about what teachers practice and what we can do individually in our acceptance and questioning of Buddhist practices. One of the things that has manifested again and again is that when there are allegations of abuse, communities will line up and circle the wagons around the teacher. Communities often are participating in the justifying of abuse, even when they hear of conduct that in any other part of their life they would immediately recognize as either criminal or, maybe just, harmful. That communities, all of us collectively, participate in not just enabling, in generating trust in a teacher who's not trustworthy, but also finally in justifying and covering up abuse. And there is this dynamic where we come to the Dharma, we become part of Buddhist communities, our values shift, our worldview shifts, we often get out of sync with the surrounding society, or the friends and family that we had interacted with a lot don't quite understand us. We're not quite so aligned with them any longer. And our participation and our membership in a Buddhist community is very important, because it's a place where those values and that way of being make sense. And also people come to religion not just for spirituality, but also for a sense of belonging, for community. That's one of the things that draws us. And so we have an identity that's very important to us that only makes sense in a Buddhist context. And we're getting all of the important basic human need for belonging satisfied in a Buddhist community. And that makes it extremely difficult and painful to recognize this community is toxic, or we are supporting someone who's harming people. And I just kind of wonder whether you've observed that and what you think about it.
2 points, or 3 maybe. One is, this is the problem. The desire or the basic need or human need for belonging. Wanting to belong to something makes you vulnerable. And identity too. So identity and belonging lead to a certain type of bondage or fixation. But if I don't know if the term bonding is correct here in the English context, but if this type of relationship is towards a healthy environment, then you have nourishment and growth. But it's not to a healthy environment, it can poison you. And initially you cannot really know it. So that's why it's an experiment to check environments if they are toxic or non-toxic, if they are more healthy than toxic. And so one of the advices I got from teachers is to go to different teachers and different communities and to check them. And I think this is a wise approach to check different types of community and to live a little bit with them. I also give this sometimes advice to people who want to become a monk. It's also not so easy to check different monasteries and different monastic environments and to make some experience. So then by this type of exploration, which is also a type of a test, you can even say an experiment, you find out more, this doesn't work so much for me, this works better, this is not really safe, this is safer, this fits more to my personality, and so on. And at the end, there is no real perfect place in this world. This cannot be, because it's samsara. And then you have to make compromises. But if the core of a group, the core of a group, which I mean with a core is, there should be at least 3, 4, or 5 people who are basically healthy. And this healthy core can then spread towards the group, if the group is not too big, to also become healthy. Otherwise, if the group is too big and there are many unhealthy people, even the healthy core can get corrupt. And if the core group is not healthy, then actually the big group can never get healthy. So, and then as far as my experience and observation goes, and also what I learned from people, it's very, very difficult and very hard to find healthy communities. This is just part of the transmission of Buddhism. And I personally say, our culture, basically, we have dysfunctional families. So in our culture, we don't have really functional families. Often they are dysfunctional. Unlike Tibetans, they have rather functional families. And so you get more support in family support in Tibetan families than in Western families. So often Dharma centers become to a ersatz family. And then a lot of the people come from a dysfunctional background. If there are a lot of people from a dysfunctional background, how can they form a functional group? This doesn't really work. So there is a type of incongruency here, which is just part of the time and part of the transmission. And one of the Tibetan teachers, Daya Rinpoche, said, the transmission from the Dharma, Buddhist teachings from India to Tibet took 500 years. So we have, and in the West, everything goes quicker. So maybe it only takes 400 years. So we were on the first 100 years. So there is a lot of struggle. There is a lot of uncertainty, ambiguity, and unhealthiness, instability, uncertainties, which I think is just part of the process. And you have also to face this reality and make the best out of it.
So making the best out of it is hard to hear when you know of so many survivors whose life has been completely traumatized, you could say damaged, whose practice has been destroyed, whose mental health has been thrown into turmoil, whose physical health has been harmed. To say that this is just part of the process, kind of, to my mind, is not quite enough. So what could be done if we're going to continue participating in this process of, this imperfect process of transmitting the Dharma? What can be done so that we're not leaving so many victims along the side of the road, writhing as we move forward?
Yeah. What we need is a better cross-cultural understanding. We need a better understanding of our culture and also of Tibetan culture. To give an example, Tibetans have a culture to deal with teachers who are not really proper in a way. It's not, in the West, it is expected, if there is a bad teacher, that there is the institutional response, a high authority who says, this person did wrong, must be, taken of the public, or this is punished for the behavior. But among Tibetan culture, as far as I understand it, then they would rather say, they have their way to communicate it, but it's not being put into the public domain. It's not that the authority says, this teacher failed. They have another way to do it. So, and what we need to develop a way which is appropriate to our culture to prevent abuse. And basically, I think for our culture, this means we must have safe structures. And the safe structure is we must have processes in the centers where abuse can be addressed. Safe ways of addressing abuse, either within the organization, and if this is not possible, there are certain ways. If it's the head teacher, you must address it outside of the group, but it must have an effect. The group must be responsible, taken into charge for what happened by an outer authority. If there is no way abuse can be addressed, it can just continue. So then what Westerners must do, they must understand the causes and conditions for abuse. And within our culture, we must establish clear structures and safe ways to address abuse. To give an example, I was bullied myself in different Buddhist centers. And in one case, I was able to evoke a higher authority to speak on my behalf and to get me out of the trouble. In another context, I was not able because the highest authority supported the bullying. So, and then I spoke with another Dharma practitioner, and he was bullied in the working environment, as a mundane, worldly things, by his boss. But when the boss bullied this Dharma practitioner, as in this, he was a teacher in school. When the director bullied the teacher, he complained about the boss because they had a safe structure to complain about bossy behavior by a boss. And then the boss was punished for what she did. So, and we need something like this in the West. But what prevents us from doing this is our naive culture. The teacher is so good. All faults are in my mind. I'm bad and I cannot. Oh, my holy teacher, I cannot confront and even ask him to sign a paper, not to abuse his students. He is too holy to do this. This is crazy. And this is a problem in our mind. So we have to understand our culture. We must understand what problems comes from this cross-cultural confusion and transmission, and what we can do in our cultural context according in how our culture functions. And Tibetans, they have to do what they have to do in their culture. It's not our topic, it's their topic. So basically, this is my understanding. What do you think about this?
Yeah, that makes perfect sense to me. So I want to conclude by asking you if you're hopeful that, let's see, we've got 100 years done, maybe we need another 300, or let's say we shorten it to, let's do it in 100, or let's do it in 50. Are you hopeful that we can make Buddhist communities safe enough? You're making the point that nothing is perfectly safe, but safe enough.
Actually, I don't have hope or no hope. For me, I take all what I here see and face, really, I see it as a teaching for myself, what I should avoid. So I basically use all of this to take responsibility for myself, to not become abusive myself, to affect my own mind where I have abusive tendencies, to be open towards criticisms from others, to use the criticism to critically reflect on myself. So, and this gives me hope, at least, that I hopefully won't be a part of, let's say, a cohort of abusive teachers. And this is already something for the world, because this is Shila Dana. Then if I take this type of responsibility, people can feel safe in my presence. And this is my gift to the world. And this is already something. But also I have to say, this is not enough. Now, the next thing is, it depends on my power in my own environment, if I can take responsibility to allow and enable and support to establish such structures. So now, personally, in my situation, I have some people who come to my courses and they want this type of safe environment. So we set up a certain structure and we do it very basic mode, and very few people are this actually. And so I also was part of the German Buddhist Union, and we also worked on structures. I did some parts on it. I could have done more, but I didn't find the time so much. So I also put energy into enabling structures in where I have power to do so. And critically, I could say I have more power to enforce such structures than I actually used. So I could have done more, but it did something. So this is another thing we can reflect. First of all, I take responsibility for myself. I use all what I face to use it as a correction, not to go this direction. And then it's beneficial for myself and others. And then based on my environment, I took what I can do in my environmental field to enable such structures. And this can be also part of a group mentality to discuss this with the group. What we can do, what can we do to use external sources, like the 30, there is a group in Great Britain which helps organizations to have safe culture, establish a safe culture where abuse can be addressed or abuse doesn't happen initially. So I think this is, and so if I am realistic with what I can do with myself and take responsibility, realistic with my environment, this gives me hope, at least in my near environment, I don't contribute to bad things. I think more I cannot do because I don't have control over other teachers and other groups. Actually, I would ask everybody who listens to this, take responsibility to demand in your Buddhist group and environment for a healthy and safe structure. I mean, a really structure where abuse can be safely addressed and where there are reliable procedures to address abuse. Because many Buddhist groups say, we don't need this. We have the shilas or the basic ethics, but this doesn't work. This doesn't work. So what everybody can do to demand this, and what we did in the German Buddhist Union, we had a self-commitment for ethical values. Teachers should not have sex with students. And we put on the website of the German Buddhist Union which Buddhist groups signed this self-commitment. And then someone can see, oh, this group didn't sign it. So what ethics are with them? And then you can be a little bit suspicious, but maybe they have even better rules. You have to find out. But this can also help. And so if we don't take responsibility to demand safe structures and to work on it, nothing will change.
I would also add not just having a structure, but having a reporting procedure or a body that you can report to that is independent of the organization, because everyone in the organization has their primary loyalty to the teacher, finally.
Yes. Actually, Carol Metchasin says, if there is an abuse on a higher hierarchical level in the Buddhist organization, it can be even done in the Buddhist organization, but if it refers to the head teacher, you need necessarily an external organization. And so what we discuss is a very complex topic. It's about safe procedures and structures. And there are professional organizations, even Dharma organizations, who help Buddhist communities to establish those structures. And we can now demand it. Yes, I think this can give us hope if everybody uses their power to demand this.
I also just want to acknowledge that you're using your abilities and your time to speak about it and to serve as a condition for reflection. And I know that this time that we've spent together, you've shared so many different elements that I think for anyone who hears them will give really a lot of inspiration to think and to rethink, and hopefully for all of us collectively from wherever we do have power to be contributing together. So I want to thank you for using your power to speak out here and to sharing all of the experiences and the deep thinking and practice that you've done around it.
Thank you, thank you, thank you. And everything good for you and everybody who has heard this. Bye-bye.